The content of the following program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. I'm an attorney with the law firm Oltman, Flynn & Kubler, where we specialize in intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights, as well as elder law. You can check us out online and view all episodes of this show on our website at oltmanpatent.com. That's oltmanpatent.com. I'd also like to thank all of our listeners, including those of you tuning in on the AM dial, as well as those watching online. If you have a question, comment, or story that you would like to share on the air, please feel free to call us toll-free at 888-565-1470. Once again, that toll-free number is 888-565-1470. We welcome your calls. I have a very special guest in studio this evening. His name is Neil Kodsey. Neil is a general litigation attorney. He's practiced in a number of areas. This evening, we'll be discussing a case that he was the lead counsel on a few years ago, back in 2012, regarding insurance, Medicaid insurance, and their obligation to pay for behavioral therapy for children with autism. And this case was a very heart-wrenching case when it finally came to its conclusion, and I think you'll definitely want to stick around to hear this story. So, Neil, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Jeff.
So, just tell us a little bit about this case. If you could just explain the backdrop of what is Medicaid and or what Medicaid is required to cover, and how these clients came to your attention.
Sure. Medicaid is a national program, but each state has its own Medicaid coverage decisions, and as long as they follow CMS, what's called the Centers for Medicaid Services guidelines, each state can make its own determinations regarding what to cover and what not to cover. Behavioral therapy is the only known, proven, effective treatment for children with autism. It's known as applied behavior analysis is another way it's termed, or behavior therapy. The children who were on Medicaid in the state of Florida were denied that treatment because the state of Florida had determined that it was experimental.
If you could just tell us a little bit about the behavioral therapy and just a general information about what it is.
Sure. I mean, being a lawyer and not a behavior analyst, I'll try to do my best, and I've got the very fortunate to meet and work with a lot of behavior analysts, but it is a behavior modification technique. One of the issues of autism spectrum disorder is that children have behavioral issues. Some of them are overly aggressive. Some of them have trouble communicating. So what you do as a behavior therapist is treat them using behavior techniques, work with them to change and modify their behavior by giving them rewards when they do well, not punishing them in the way we would think of punishing them, but not rewarding them and being as positive with them when they don't do well. And so it is a complete behavior modification technique that was actually, it started in the 1940s and is a military issue to train soldiers. And it has developed over time now as a treatment technique for individuals with mental disorders or conditions such as autism. It's been a very beneficial treatment for children with autism and has been adopted by the Surgeon General, Centers for Disease Control, and numerous other federal organizations as the only proven effective treatment for autism.
And of course, it's very important that this treatment be administered at an early age.
Yeah, one of the issues in our case, which we learned through the scientific literature, was that really if you don't catch a child by the time they're 7, it is much, much harder for them to develop naturally, especially if they're nonverbal by the age of 7. I don't want anybody out there with an 8-year-old autistic child who hasn't received treatment to think that it's hopeless. Obviously, there are things you can do, but just based on statistics alone and the way the studies show, you really got to catch that child at 3. And once you get to 7, it really becomes almost exponentially harder for them to get the treatment.
So in this case, the ACA, the Agency for Healthcare Administration, which is the Florida agency that administers and pays out Medicaid benefits, took a position that it was not required to pay for this behavioral therapy.
Correct. Yeah.
And so these clients came to you and just wondered what they could do to fight this. And if you could tell me a little bit about where it went from there.
Sure. And just to be clear, so the audience understands, the clients actually went to Florida Legal Services and Legal Services of Greater Miami, which are two of our leading legal organizations in the state of Florida that help indigent population, help people that can't afford lawyers. They've done some great work, and they get lawyers like myself to help try cases with them pro bono because they don't have as much of a trial team and as much trial experience, but they know Medicaid law better than anyone. There was a lot of discussion around the country about which state would be the best to first try this case in, and because of the strength of Florida Legal Services and Legal Services of Greater Miami, Florida was the test state to bring this lawsuit. The children came to Legal Services. We had 3. Their parents came and asked what we could do, and when we shared that with everybody, we decided we wanted to pursue their rights for them in federal court and try to get this benefit for them and for the other thousands of children around the state that weren't getting it.
And of course, if the court ruled that the Agency for Healthcare Administration was required to provide these benefits to your clients, then they would have to provide them for everyone else in the state.
Right. One of the reasons that Florida was chosen as one of the better states to pursue this is that Florida ACA, Agency for Healthcare Administration, had actually gone as far as to have a policy saying that they would affirmatively not cover behavioral therapy because they deemed it an experimental treatment. Not only was that asinine, and we can get to that later, but because they had a policy, what we were suing was to invalidate a written policy, not just a vague determination from child to child. They had a policy that applied to all children in the state. So once we could invalidate that policy and have a court say it was unlawful, the policy gets removed, and then every child gets the benefit.
And so they weren't so ACA was not taking the position that only certain children on the autism spectrum would not benefit from this therapy. It was saying that nobody was going to benefit
They were
from this
taking
therapy.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no,
They were
please.
taking a classic one-size-fits-all or no size fits nobody approach. And by doing that, they opened themselves up to a much easier attack, I think, because the science clearly demonstrated again that this was the proven effective treatment for autism.
Now, what were private insurers doing at this time?
Well, that's what was interesting, and I think that was one of the things that frustrated our judge when she heard the evidence, is that in 2008, the state of Florida passed the Geller Act, which actually requires certain private insurers to cover applied behavior analysis for autistic children. If you work for an employer that has 50 employees or more, and it's not a self-insured plan, but it's through a private insurance company, whether it be Cigna or Aetna or Blue Cross Blue Shield, if you're on that type of employer plan, that company is actually required to provide this benefit for children.
Interesting. So as you were trying the case, what was the position that the government, the ACA, was taking?
Well, what happens is when you're trying to determine whether a treatment is effective, you have to do certain studies called epidemiologic or biostatistical studies that look at small samples of children being treated and whether it's effective or not. And rather than look at the fact that every study that ever looked at this issue showed that children were benefiting, they pointed to criticisms of the studies that they were too small. They didn't adjust for all the statistical variances properly. They had things called confounding factors, and I don't want to get into too much boring detail about the statistics, but they were trying to poke holes at all the studies. But the problem was you had 1,000 studies, and every single one pointed in the same direction. And you and I, Jeff, had a chance to talk a little before about my background. Prior to this, at one point in my career, I was one of the national trial counsel for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, and had learned a lot about statistical studies and what they show and don't show. And what I actually argued to the judge in closing argument and was able to demonstrate with the witnesses was that the state method for interpreting the science and using that method to deny this treatment for children was exactly the same way that the tobacco industry was interpreting the science in the 1980s to deny that smoking caused lung cancer. All the studies pointed in one direction, but they tried to poke holes at each of the individual methodologies, and that's just not the way science works.
Well, there's always going to be certain flaws in
Right.
studies, and I've worked as a scientist myself, and one of the things that you always put in any publication is you always say what your limitations are.
Right.
And for example, with smoking, and you're examining the link between smoking and cancer, the one limitation you're always going to have is that you can't have controlled experiments, right? So you're going to have to look at people that were smoking. There's no way to really verify how long they've been smoking, how much,
Correct.
et cetera. So there's always going to be some flaws or some limitations in trying to draw a conclusion from those studies. However, when you have a wealth of studies out there, you have a lot of studies all saying the same thing. That's really all that policymakers and the courts can go with.
Right.
So they were just trying to poke holes in the conclusion that you were positing at that time, which is that the behavioral therapy was not only beneficial to children with autism, but really a necessary treatment if you're going to effectively manage this condition. And so how did it unfold from there? Because we were talking before the show when you were cross-examining the expert for the Agency for Healthcare Administration.
One of the things we didn't talk about was we got a hold of an email that was sent out by the lawyer representing ACA, because they sent an email out to universities all across Florida. And in the email, they said, we're having trouble finding an expert to testify for us that this treatment doesn't work.
Which should have been a red flag right there.
Right. And so one of our experts got the email because he was at the faculty of Florida State and shared it with us. And that email actually got before the judge in evidence. But the only expert they were able to finally find was someone who was purely what I will call an expert in reading literature. We see a lot of that in litigation. They had to find someone all the way out in Portland, Oregon. And I remember arguing to Judge Leonard that I'm not an expert in geography, but when searching for an expert to testify in a Miami courtroom, I can't think of a place in the United States you would have to travel too much further than to get to Oregon.
Unless it's some very arcane subject matter, which this was not.
Yeah. So the expert was someone who is an epidemiologist, meaning someone who does statistical research, but not an expert in any particular condition. And once we started walking her through what the actual study showed, and I was able to cross-examine her, actually, ironically, using the techniques I learned in representing the tobacco industry, finally, I asked a question at the end, and I said to her, I could have saved us a lot of time if I just asked you this up front, but you're really not an expert on autism. And she kind of looked at me and said, no, I'm not. And that's one of those Perry Mason moments you don't get that often when you're cross-examining an expert on the other side.
So what I find, I mean, this is a very inspirational story. At the same time, I'm very troubled that our government officials and our agencies are going to this length to try to avoid doing the right thing, which is to provide necessary treatment for children. Because one of the things you have to realize about this case is we're talking about kids here.
Right.
And we're not talking about ambulance chasers as the term. I don't like that term, but you're not talking
Right,
about.
no lawyer does.
Whatever somebody would normally think of with associated with people, adults certainly suing each other and so forth. We're talking about children that need this treatment in order to potentially manage this syndrome. So, what are your thoughts on that? How troubling is this?
Well, to quote the late President Ronald Reagan, the problem with government is that it has no natural predator. And in many ways, we as lawyers have to become the predators when the government's doing something like that and try to get people the rights that they deserve. So I think that it is troubling. And hopefully cases like this will teach people a lesson that they've got to take positions based on sound science and also based on who they're protecting, and that's children. And I think that's very important.
We're going to have to take a short break to hear from our sponsors, and we'll be back with Neil. Please stay tuned.
This program is brought to you by Fresh Start Tax. Fresh Start Tax offers a full range of tax and accounting services, including tax return preparation and bookkeeping, as well as back taxes, wage garnishments, unfiled returns, or any other tax-related concern. Our dedicated team of tax attorneys, CPAs, and former IRS agents offer over 60 years of professional tax experience. For a free consultation, call 866-700-1040. That's 866-700-1040. You can also visit us on the web at freshstarttax.com. This program is brought to you by the law firm of Altman, Flynn, and Kubler. Our law firm specializes in elder law and intellectual property, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. If you would like to patent your idea, please contact our Fort Lauderdale office for a free consultation. We offer elder law services, including estate planning, long-term care planning, and preparation of healthcare documents. We strive to plan for your future needs while allowing you to retain as much dignity and independence as possible. To find out more or to make an appointment, call 954-563-4814. That's 954-563-4814. Or visit us online at altmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. Spokesperson, not an attorney. You're listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, back to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese.
And we're back. This is Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. We've been discussing autism and a lawsuit involving patients, children with autism, and and coverage under Medicaid for behavioral therapy. My guest this evening is Neil Kodzie. Before the break, we were discussing this case and how by prevailing, this actually forced the government, in this case the Agency for Healthcare Administration, which administers the Florida Medicaid program, that it forces them to provide behavioral therapy for all children, or for all patients with autism across the state that are on Medicaid. And so that was one of the very important aspects of this lawsuit. It wasn't just your clients, but was for everyone. And I'd like to ask about the potential domino effect that this case may have across the country.
Yeah, and I was very fortunate to be invited last November to the National Legal Summit put on by Autism Speaks. And one of the things we talked about at that summit was, as soon as the appellate court affirmed our decision, because lawyers like to appeal cases, and so the state appealed, believe it or not, and they lost, and the 11th Circuit affirmed the case, that the Centers for Medicaid then issued a proclamation saying that applied behavior analysis should be covered under Medicaid and state programs. And what we've seen is states around the country, and behind the scenes, Centers for Medicaid basically cited to our case as the reason. And we've had a couple of other trials in Washington and Michigan after our case where Medicaid was required. And so what we're seeing are states around the country now providing this benefit. So whereas we estimated that as a result of our victory, 8,000 children in Florida were getting this benefit, and every year that'll be 8,000 new kids or whatever the number is. Around the country, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of children that are able to get this benefit that weren't getting it before. And that's very, you get emotional as a lawyer when you're able to accomplish that. And again, I don't want to take full credit. We had the legal services teams from Florida Legal Services of Greater Miami, but as a team, that's an accomplishment that if I do nothing else in my career, I can feel very proud of.
And you think about it for a minute, this, like we were talking about before the break, this is the only known therapy for autism that has this level of effectiveness. And in fact, you were discussing with one of the experts that you had retained, a neurologist. You said if you didn't prescribe this treatment, it would be medical malpractice.
Right. That was when I put the pediatric neurologist on the stand at trial. I asked her that question, and she said, yes, it would be medical malpractice not to prescribe it. And that resonated well with the judge as well.
It would be malpractice because the negative effect of denying or of withholding this treatment from an autism patient would be so severe that a doctor could potentially lose their license over it.
Right.
And as important as it is that they received this treatment, the state was taking the position it was experimental. That really just shows a disconnect between the state and the medical reality of autism.
Right, because what they were claiming was that they weren't claiming that the studies showed it didn't work. They were claiming that the studies were insufficient to show that it did work. And that really, when you think about it, when they had to admit on cross-examination that every study does show it works, they just didn't like the study. But they couldn't find one study that went the other direction. So if it really didn't work, you would think that somebody who studied it correctly, if you bought into the state's view of science, would have determined that it was ineffective. And there was no study saying that it was ineffective.
It's really amazing because what the state basically said is that it was uncertain whether this was working, and the cost of trying to become certain was just so high. You had, like you said, 100,000 children not being treated
Right.
across the country. It's really mind-boggling. And on the related subject, I'd like to talk about some issues that have come up with caps on some of these employer plans. And we were discussing before the show that some of these might be unconstitutional, that there are caps on benefits for people whose children are covered through their employer's plan.
Right, because what happens is we have now states around the country that have these insurance laws like the Geller Act I spoke about earlier that was adopted in Florida in 2008 that requires private insurance companies under certain circumstances to cover applied behavior analysis for children. But the Geller Act allows these insurance companies to cap coverage at $36,000 a year and $200,000 lifetime. Well, those caps may violate federal mental health parity laws. And so there are a group of attorneys around the country that are looking at that. And I would say to anyone that's listening, if you have a situation where you're getting treatment under an insurance plan and they've capped you at $36,000 a year and you're not getting treatment that you should, or you've hit the $200,000 lifetime, you may have a claim that violates federal mental health parity law. And I think we're going to see lawsuits around the country start. There's been one in Pennsylvania settled very early, but I think we're going to start to see lawsuits like that around the country now to get people the full level of benefit. It would be like giving someone half their chemotherapy. Well, half's not enough. And so for some children, they need more than that $36,000 and more than that $200,000 lifetime.
And that could be potentially unconstitutional, like
Right.
you said, because you have federal, with something that's called preemption, which is that federal law
Right.
has priority over state law. And states can't say, no, we disagree with federal law, we want to do our own thing. They can't do that. That's unconstitutional, and it appears that that's what they're doing here. Do you think that this is a direct result of intense lobbying by the insurance industry with the state government? Because from what I've read and from what I've heard, there's a lot of lobbying at the state level that often can't be done at the federal level.
I will say from my friends at Autism Speaks that when they try to lobby to get these laws passed to help these children get benefits, that their primary opponent is the insurance industry. And look, insurance industry is a business. They need to make money, but this is an issue that I think everybody's just got to come to grips with, that if it's the only proven effective treatment and you're dealing with children, it's important enough that we need to get coverage.
So I'd like to ask you about Obamacare, because one of the important aspects of the Affordable Care Act is that the insurance company can't deny you for having a pre-existing condition. And I know that this was an issue for a lot of people that had autism that couldn't receive therapy for it if they had a lapse in coverage before Obamacare. That's no longer the case. How important has that prohibition against pre-existing conditions been?
I think that probably it's going to be very beneficial for the community of parents with autistic children, that they can look at that and maybe get coverage where they might not have otherwise been able to get it. I think it's still going to be dependent a little bit on what type of plan you have, because if your plan didn't provide the treatment before Obamacare, I'm not sure that it's required to afterwards. It's more along the lines of if you come into a plan with that condition as a new plan recipient, then I think Obamacare gives you some added protection that you might not have otherwise had.
So I'd like to turn our attention just to a more general discussion of if you're in a position where you've gotten a denial letter from your insurance company, it's said that we deny this treatment or we deny this therapy for whatever reason, and you think you might have been wronged, what are your options?
Well, you would want to retain counsel, retain a lawyer that understands insurance law and can look at your plan and see whether it was an appropriate or inappropriate denial. You can, as yourself, go to the Department of Insurance and fill out a civil remedy notice, called a CNS, which gives the insurance company 60 days to change its opinion. Now, depending on what treatment you've been denied, if you've been denied a life-saving treatment, 60 days may be too late. For a child with autism, 60 days might not necessarily be a problem if you're not getting the treatment. So if you can get it. So I would look, and you can fill that form out online too. And that's something that a lot of people don't know that they can do. And it gets a chance for you to recover attorney's fees if you later file a lawsuit and win.
And that's an important thing, because by the statute allowing you to recover attorney's fees, that may put you in a position where you don't have to be paying your attorney along the way, because the attorney that's representing you can recover from the insurance company
Right.
after the fact. And that's why it's important to see an attorney. A lot of people don't think that they can afford it, but in this case, the statute provides for attorney's fees, which is important. In the couple minutes that we have left, I'd like, if I could ask you to give out your contact information.
Absolutely.
To our listeners in the event they're in need of your services.
Okay. My website is ndcodseylaw.com. That's ndkodsiylaw.com. And it has some of the videos from some of the presentations I've given about the case. And my email is ndk, my three initials, Neil David Codsey, at ndcodseylaw.com. And feel free to email me with any questions that you have.
And you also practice in some other areas, including employment law as well.
I do a lot of labor and employment law, intellectual property. I'm a trial lawyer,
Right.
and so I enjoy complex matters in trial, and so I've done a lot of various areas of law.
We're going to have to end it there. I'd like to, again, give a very special thanks to my guest, Neil Codsey. You've been listening to Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. Please tune in next Tuesday evening from 6 to 6:30, where my guest will be cognitive neuropsychologist Gina Harris, and we'll be discussing the insanity plea and the upcoming trial of the Aurora, Colorado shooter, James Holmes. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding